The 33 Strategies of War by Robert Greene teaches different approaches to conflict. Greene examines ways to defeat an enemy in contexts ranging from violent battlefields to the sets of famous Hollywood films. Using historical anecdotes and other real-life stories, Greene explains offensive maneuvers, defensive tactics, and cunning strategies that give warriors the advantages they need to succeed in life. An essential truth one should embrace is that one is always at war, not just with enemies, but also with colleagues, friends, and acquaintances. Admitting that war is constant can be socially isolating, so many people prefer not to. Yet everyone has rivals, regardless of their situation in life. Everyone has experienced betrayal from the people who are closest to them. These facts don't reflect human failings so much as human nature. In light of these challenges, people must be aggressive, self-interested, and strategic. How one handles these conflicts determines whether or not one succeeds in life. Individual battles don't matter so much as long-term goals. An effective warrior must always keep long-term goals in sight, never losing his or her focus. Rationality and cold contemplation are always more useful than the heat of some passing emotion. Intelligent fighting is about outwitting the opponent, preferably without bloodshed or collateral damage. Such victories are born of deep psychological understanding, not passion or shallow one-upmanship. Before warriors can turn their focus toward defeating an enemy, it becomes necessary to prepare their own mind for the conflict. Hostile, dangerous people must be handled with care. An enemy's wiles can be distracting and ultimately devastating. Warriors must keep their imaginations under control, yet cultivate the ability to think on their feet. Real military leaders don't act alone. Instead, they leverage the power of a skillful team or army to reach goals more quickly. Generals must lead their armies with assurance, never falling into the trap of listening too much to other people's advice. The chain of command should be clear, but not oppressive. Armies always require ample moral support and material supplies to do their jobs. Out of necessity, war is sometimes conducted on the defensive. People in this situation should pick their battles carefully, analyzing the enemy to see what sort of response is appropriate. Some aggressors should be deterred or avoided altogether. Warriors who happen to be on the offensive should strike first and fast, working to keep the enemy off balance and out of sorts. Speed is everything. Opponents' weaknesses should be leveraged whenever possible to make victory easier. Finally, in war, it's important to remember that things aren't necessarily what they seem. Defeat is never inevitable. Underdogs can seize big advantages if they spot the right opportunities. Useful alliances can be cultivated, particularly by warriors who are willing to think outside the box. Deceptions can be perpetrated by those who know how to weave fact and fiction together into believable lies. Even terrorism is available to those who wish to consider it as a last resort. Whatever direction a war takes, warriors must maintain their presence of mind and always reserve an exit strategy. Defeat is inevitable sometimes, even for people who are used to winning. Failing well will help make sure a one-time loss doesn't turn into a chronic pattern. It's important to develop a grand strategy. Too many people get caught up in the minute battles of day-to-day, living without developing an overarching strategy. A grand strategy has 4 main characteristics. First, the strategy is goal-oriented. Second, a grand strategy has deep perspective, meaning it considers things in the fullness of time instead of in the heat of a single moment. Third, the strategy is considered. The people who possess it take the time to understand what fuels the other side of the conflict. And finally, the strategy has subtlety. In business, many so-called strategies fail because they're more like one-dimensional goals than fully realized strategies. For example, a goal would be to sell more widgets than a competitor. A strategy would describe how the company intends to sell more widgets. Even C-suite business people confuse broad strategies with narrow tactics, failing to articulate the choices or steps along the way that will help them reach a given goal. Even when a company or an army is guided by a strategy, if the strategy is not properly articulated, it might fail at the level of implementation. A real strategy should have the capacity to guide an army's choice, so the troops will know how to behave in a given situation. To boost buy-in, it may help to explain the logic behind the strategy. Fighters who feel vested in a strategy and who can truly understand the reason why a certain choice or action is required of them are more likely to follow their leaders to victory. There are two main styles of military engagement: conventional and guerrilla warfare. Throughout most of history, world powers have engaged in conventional warfare, which involves a theater of war with military sides that can be easily distinguished from one another and from civilians. Dominic Tierney, a professor of political science at Swarthmore College, has likened this traditional style to the Super Bowl, where two sides meet on a field until a clear, indisputable winner emerges victorious. Until 1945 and the end of World War II, the U.S. military excelled in conventional-style conflicts. But this style of warfare has since fallen out of fashion, and the United States has struggled to adapt. Modern guerrilla warfare is messier than its conventional counterpart. The guerrilla style complicates the clear-cut notion of a Super Bowl-type conflict. Since World War II, Tierney says, the dominant style of warfare around the world has been insurgency, mainly civil wars in which victory is tenuous even when it's possible. Today, 90% of conflicts begin as civil wars that are heavily invested in guerrilla tactics. The United States continually enters these conflicts, but its traditional warfare tactics and shows of brute force have not been effective. Of the U.S. involvement in major wars in Korea, Vietnam, the Persian Gulf, Iraq, and Afghanistan, Tierney points to just one clear victory: the Gulf War under President George H.W. Bush in 1991. The other wars were, or continue to be, protracted, with no potential for tidy closure, much less what could be called a victory. For this losing streak to change, the United States must stop involving itself in guerrilla conflicts. Indeed, warriors will find it's best to avoid guerrilla conflicts in general. Sometimes war requires the use of unconventional, unpopular tactics. Unconventional warfare, also known as dirty warfare, involves tactics that may seem unfair or unjust, that inspire fear in citizens and soldiers alike. Guerrilla-style fighters, especially terrorists, often rely on dirty warfare in lieu of more conventional military methods. But even traditional-style forces like the U.S. military engage in unconventional tactics, leaving experts and citizens to argue about programs that are not well publicized, well monitored, or even well understood. In the 21st century, the United States has increasingly relied on drone warfare, a tactic that is controversial and frequently shrouded in secrecy. Drone technology lets the American military secretly monitor and swiftly kill far-flung targets without the prospect of immediate retaliation. In one program headquartered in central Kansas, military officials monitor and analyze a live video feed of potential targets in the Middle East, watching for signs of terrorist activity and killing targets that are deemed too dangerous. For proponents of drone warfare, the system is ideal because it fights terrorism without putting American soldiers in harm's way. But critics of drone warfare question the moral implications, particularly with regard to collateral damage. Journalists estimate that 1 in 5 drone strikes kill Middle Eastern civilians, not terrorists, a number that's much higher than what has been reported by the American government. According to traditional military ethics, it's possible to weigh the number of civilians slain against the number of lives saved by thwarting a terrorist attack. In other words, civilian deaths, while unfortunate, can be justified. But it's difficult to do the math, so to speak, when information about the drone warfare program is not open to public scrutiny. Further, the question of which activities constitute terrorism, specifically the line between planning and executing a terrorist act, has been raised by military ethicists. After the terrorist attacks of September 11, 2001, George W. Bush shifted American defense policy to emphasize preventive and preemptive measures designed to thwart potential danger, instead of reacting to extant danger. Barack Obama's presidency continued to transform what, exactly, is understood as potential danger, broadening the scope for what can be considered a terrorist act. Ethical questions abound, including whether military operatives in Kansas can truly decide, using only a video feed, when a Middle Eastern civilian crosses the line into terrorism. It's crucial to know and understand the enemy. Being able to identify and study the enemy is fundamental to wartime strategy. However, guerrilla-style warfare complicates this process because it's impossible to discern militants from civilians. Unlike warriors meeting on a battlefield, modern fighters can often blend into the general population at will. In various conflicts in the so-called War on Terror, the inherent unknowability of terrorists has been exacerbated by faulty intelligence gathering. The Iraq War, for instance, was launched by George W. Bush on the incorrect assumption that Iraq still harbored weapons of mass destruction. In President Bush's haste to oust Saddam Hussein, he made the fundamental error of not understanding his enemy. Another challenge to knowing the enemy in U.S. conflicts in the Middle East has been the sheer complexity of insurgencies across the region, which can be intricate and confusing, especially to outsiders. Some conflicts involve multiple rebel factions that require a thorough understanding of complex cultural nuances to fully comprehend. The comprehension problem has been exacerbated by the militarization of U.S. foreign policy, which began in earnest during the presidency of George W. Bush. In War on Peace 2018, Ronan Farrow, a journalist who once worked in the State Department, traces the U.S. shift away from diplomacy. In Afghanistan and Egypt, for example, the U.S. military has worked with local warlords to disastrous effect. Throughout the same period, under Republican and Democratic administrations alike, the U.S. government has greatly curtailed material aid, especially civilian efforts to support economic development. This has been especially disastrous in Afghanistan and Pakistan, where poor farmers have had a complex relationship with the Taliban. Diplomats are interested in understanding and influencing such relationships, whereas military intelligence often doesn't reflect the same level of nuance. In war, decisions must be made dispassionately. Wartime strategy sessions require a cool head and analytical thinking. Personal emotions must not be permitted to intrude, because they will lead to bad decisions. It's important to recognize that emotions tend to carry over from one situation to the next, leaving a residue that can color experience and decision-making. For example, a general who has an argument with his brother about the family business might carry over negative feelings into a military strategy session later in the day. For a civilian, the simple act of getting stuck in traffic in the morning can make someone less receptive to new ideas in an afternoon meeting. The science of emotion regulation has attracted considerable interest in recent years, particularly with regard to regulating the negative emotions brought on by stress. Experts suggest that people can, to some degree, inoculate themselves against major stressors by exposing themselves to minor stressors beforehand. For example, a person who needs to have surgery might visit the hospital in the days before to learn more about what to expect on the day of the procedure. A person who has to give a high-stakes work presentation might include a karaoke night as an alternative form of rehearsal. When unwanted stress crops up, which is for most people inevitable, controlled breathing techniques can help refocus the mind. Deception and misdirection are fundamental tactics in war. In The Art of War, the great military strategist Sun Tzu observed, "All warfare is based on deception." Being able to traffic in misdirection is a critical skill for warriors to develop. During World War II, the Allies succeeded in the invasion of Normandy by stoking Adolf Hitler's paranoia, making him guess and second-guess where the next attack would be. This deception was elaborately orchestrated and included planting information with double agents and staging a fake military theater. One of the ways the Allies fed Nazi Germany false information was using codebreakers who could decipher encrypted information. Thanks in part to Alan Turing, the English mathematician, some of Germany's most crucial coded messages were intercepted by Allied forces. At the time, Germany conveyed thousands of encrypted messages on a daily basis, containing information that varied from weather reports to Hitler's direct orders. Lesser-known efforts were made in the United States by the so-called Code Girls, young women who were secretly trained in code breaking. The Code Girls created the fake radio transmissions that helped make the invasion of Normandy possible. In other conflicts during the war, the Code Girls' information helped sink supply ships and soften the Germans' attacks. Critically, the Allies never flaunted these victories, so Germany wasn't aware that its code had been broken. Military, political, and cultural warriors should always try to counter expectations. Warriors of all kinds should try to avoid discernible patterns and predictable moves. Among cultural warriors, fine artists with the ability to shock and provoke have been among the most memorable and successful. Marcel Duchamp's Fountain, a found object work consisting of a porcelain urinal, scandalized the public and also shifted the public's perception of what exactly constituted art. An artist who pushed the art world's buttons in a different, and perhaps even more transformative, way was Robert Rauschenberg, an American best known for his paintings. His piece, Un2known Drawing 1953, asked audiences to reconsider the very nature of art, much in the way of Duchamp's fountain. But instead of relying on the coarse joke of placing a urinal in a gallery space, Rauschenberg scandalized the art world by breaking a very different taboo. He literally erased the work of another artist, Willem de Kooning, who was considered a master. Rauschenberg's relationship to the art world was so antagonistic that he considered no unspoken law to be unbreakable, including the idea that valuable works should not be defaced. The critical turn was that even as Rauschenberg erased another artist's work, he was creating a brand new work, albeit one that focused on absence and erasure instead of mark-making. Erased de Kooning was a piece that derived much of its meaning from its backstory, which made it an ephemeral performance as much as an enduring piece. It remains a work that requires context to fully understand. A person could not look at the blank page and divine its origin story. The first 10 years of its existence, Erased de Kooning was little known, but a profile on Rauschenberg that ran in The New Yorker in 1964 made an instant and enduring impression on the art world. Today, the piece is the most requested artwork for loans and reproduction in the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art, a museum that houses more than 30,000 works, including many of Rauschenberg's. Alliances should be chosen carefully. Unexpected partners that fulfill a specific purpose are ideal. Often, when people choose to ally with others, they opt for obvious partnerships and long-term commitment. This is folly. The best alliances are limited and geared toward a specific purpose. A secret or unexpected alliance is ideal because enemies won't anticipate it, and if they do find out, they will be confused and confounded. An example of an unlikely yet productive partnership from recent history is Israel and Egypt, who have secretly combined forces against Islamist militants in Egypt, starting sometime around 2016. The militants, who are pledged to ISIS, downed a Russian passenger jet and have killed soldiers and police in Egypt. Egypt's own military had been unable to squash the insurgents, so it appreciated the outside assistance. Israel possesses the military means to pursue the terrorists, an act that is in its own best interest because it helps secure borders and stabilize the region. As a result, Israel has provided manned and unmanned weaponry, including drones, helicopters, and jets. The vehicles have all been unmarked, carrying out frequent strikes that have been fully endorsed by the Egyptian government, albeit behind closed doors. This partnership between Egypt and Israel is one example of a broader trend in the Middle East, where Arab countries are finding common ground with Israel in the fight against jihadists. But such arrangements exist on shaky ground politically, given the animosity that most governments in the region have shown toward the Jewish state. In the fight against these particular terrorists in Egypt, both Israel and Egypt have tried to hide their arrangement to avoid backlash. Historically, the two countries have been at odds, fighting on opposite sides of 3 different wars.